All right, so let's start unpacking at the more individual level how these structures, these institutionalized forms of racism have been able to sustain and reproduce themselves even after laws have been put in place that have attempted to reduce racial inequality and racial discrimination. It all has to do with this concept of racial bias. All right, so in the previous lecture videos, we took a look at how institutions like the employment, the workforce, education, healthcare, law enforcement, the judicial system, etc., all have institutional racism built within the fabric of their social structures because the United States was historically built on this premise of racism. Now, that's not to say that doctors, that law enforcement, that employers, educators, bankers, real estate agents, etc. are intentionally racist. Like I said, the majority of people in the United States today are not overtly racist. It's important to recognize that things like the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacy and organizations similar to those still exist in the United States today. They are still very much a threat in our country today. But the majority of people would agree that the Ku Klux Klan is awful, that white supremacy is horrible, that they're based on these awful ideas of eugenics and the disenfranchisement of people of color simply based off these unfounded and ungrounded claims. However, when we live in a society that socializes us to associate people of color with negative labels or meanings, and similarly to associate white people with positive labels and meanings, we uncontrollably develop what are called implicit racial biases, which affect the ways in which we view and treat people in our society based on their skin color. All right, so we can really draw heavily on the sociological theory of symbolic interactionism to explain why this is here. For centuries, skin color was used in our country as a symbol to assign meaning and value to a person, right? Even after slavery was abolished, even after the Civil Rights Act was put into place, the meaning of a person's skin color did not automatically disappear, right? We can't just flip a switch to automatically change the meaning of a symbol that has been built within our society for centuries, right? So as a result of that, racist attitudes and practices were kept alive by racist institutions, policies, and individuals who socialized future generations to maintain this racist culture. This has a lot to do with the socialization process and agents of socialization, right? Think back to when we talked about cultural lag too. That might also be helpful here. Just because there's a change in some piece of technology or some policy change takes place in any given society, it doesn't automatically mean that all members of that society automatically start using and applying that technology or support or endorse that policy change, right? People are very stubborn. We don't like change. We resist it, especially individuals who feel like they have something to lose. So that's why in the South, we saw a lot of Southern states, even after, the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, we still had a lot of Southern states that enacted Jim Crow laws and black codes. So they continued to disenfranchise people of color because white people didn't want to give up their position of power and authority, right? That's a very conflict theorist idea. And symbolic interactionism helps us understand how these meanings of feelings of symbols of racial superiority and inferiority are passed from generation to generation. If you grew up in the South, you may have lived in a city that proudly flew Confederate flags or had Confederate monuments, erected of Army generals who endorsed and were fighting to maintain slavery in the Confederacy in the United States, right? And if you did, you may be subject to having more direct racial bias because of the product of the environment that you were a part of. It's not that you asked to be socialized to have racial biases, but you can't control the agents of socialization that you're bombarded with, especially as a child. Luckily, now that you are all adults, you are able to do some conscious reflection. I shouldn't say you, we, myself included, we are able as adults to reflect on our racial biases because we all have them, myself included, because again, we can't control being a product of the environment that we were raised in, okay? So how and why does racism still exist today? Well, can you specifically think of any ways you've been socialized to endorse problematic racial stereotypes? What agents of socialization were responsible for transmitting this perception? This is really important. Take a few minutes and do a self-audit. Reflect on your upbringing. Reflect on your childhood. Reflect on the messages that were conveyed to you, whether it be by family, by education, by your teachers, by your textbooks, by the media that you watch, by TV shows or music or movies that you've seen, right? What messages have you been taught about races, about racial differences in the United States? And think about how those messages that you've been taught perpetuate harmful stereotypes about people of color, and subsequently how they might advance positive stereotypes about white people, right? I mean, we see this everywhere. When you flick on the TV, do you see an equal representation of people of color in a positive light that you do for white people in our society? How long did it take us to elect an African American president of the United States? Why have we still not elected a woman to be president of the United States? It's because we have these racial and gender biases that are ingrained in the institutions of our society, of our country, and they're very difficult for us to escape at the individual level because the agents of socialization we're exposed to perpetuate these messages into our minds so deeply that they become part of our subconscious, right? And that's what implicit racial bias means. Something that's implicit means that we don't necessarily recognize that it's there. We're not consciously aware of it, but it's subconsciously part of our mentality, of our psyche, because of how we've been socialized. So depending on your upbringing, these messages could both consciously and subconsciously affect our social development and become ingrained into our minds, right? Think of the positive connotations our society associates simply with the color white, not even associated with white skin color, but white in general as a color is associated with purity. It's associated with heaven, right? With light, with goodness, versus black, which is a color that we're taught to associate with something that's dirty or tarnished, something that's dark or evil or bad in our society. And these symbols, these simple connotations, these word associations that we have also affect the way that we view race and racism in our society today, right? These stereotypes are so powerful that even people of color are socialized to have racial biases. In fact, one study found that both white and black doctors were more likely to offer preventative health care procedures to white patients, right? So it's not just saying that white people are the only ones that are socialized to have racial biases against people of color. People of color are socialized to have racial biases against other people of color. Because again, we live in this society where the structures in our society, the institutions in our society were built on racist ideology. And while we've made progress in restructuring those institutions, we haven't made it all the way yet. We're not there all the way yet. We still have work to do, right? So one other thing you might want to reflect on at this point is the implicit association test, which I asked you to complete in the content for this week. What do you think about your results? This implicit association test has undergone quite a bit of scrutiny. It's definitely not a perfect scientific measure of racial bias, but it is a good kind of general and broad strokes way to assess whether or not you may have an implicit bias, particularly in this instance, in terms of having a racial bias in our society. And again, just because we may have racial biases, which inevitably we all do, it doesn't make us racist. It just means that we are products of the environment that we're a part of. Okay. Now, the important thing that we need to do as socially ethical and responsible adults is put in the work to recognize and acknowledge that we do have racial biases. And then beyond that, put in the work to try and address these. So since we live in a society that was built on institutional racism, we are all exposed to racist ideas, beliefs, and values to some degree. Now, as a result, we are all socialized to have racial bias. Like I said before, even people of color are socialized to have racial biases. And this does not mean that we are all racist, but it does mean that we all likely have been subconsciously conditioned to privilege whiteness and to disenfranchise anyone that is a person of color in our society. If we ever want to have a society where racism no longer exists, we need to put in the work to recognize our own racial biases and work to correct them. It's very, very easy to claim to be not racist. It's very easy to deny ourselves the work that it takes to look inward and reflect on our own experiences and beliefs and how they may have been influenced by racist institutions. Because specifically for us white folks, if we don't feel like we're negatively being impacted by racism, it's easy for us to not care. It's easy for us to not do anything because it's not affecting us personally. And quite frankly, that's just a pathetic excuse for humans to not act against instances of social inequality. If we only do things when we're negatively affected by them, it just perpetuates this selfish connotation that is extremely problematic, and nothing is going to be accomplished if we really don't all work, all people, including white people, to confront social inequalities, particularly racism. And that's why Dr. Kendi, who has become very popular, he's a historian, one of the leading historians on this concept of anti-racism. He explains that the difference between being not racist versus anti-racist is that anti-racist people acknowledge the ways in which they have enabled racism through their own implicit biases, and they actively work to fight racism. It's not enough anymore to just say, I'm not racist, and that's that. If you're not putting in work to fight racism, you're enabling racism to continue, right? So I would definitely recommend reading some of Dr. Kennedy's work. His most recent book, How to Be Anti-Racist, is a brilliant read. It provides a lot of great historical context and takes a very intersectional approach to look at how racism is both affected by and related to issues pertaining to social economic status, gender, sexuality, etc. So I would encourage that. Now, I'm not sitting here trying to lecture white people, myself included, about how bad we are. And this is very important as we get into what will be the final video of this lecture series, where we tackle the topic of white privilege. But what's important is to recognize that for centuries, us white people have been able to live our lives relatively unbothered by racism. Like I said, if it's not impacting us directly, or if we don't understand how racism is impacting us directly, it's easy for us to turn a blind eye, or to kind of soften our guilt or shame that we might feel for racism by using rhetoric, things like saying, oh, I'm not racist, I have a friend who's African American, or I'm not racist, I don't see color, I only see people. You know, that's what's referred to now as colorblind racism or colorblind ideology. And the problems with statements like that is that what they're really doing is not being anti-racist. They're not even acknowledging the existence of racism. They're just these kind of rhetorical tropes that white people will often use to make ourselves feel better, to get rid of any shame or guilt that we might have every time we turn on the TV and see another person of color who's been murdered, or the subject of police brutality because of the color of our skin. And when we tell ourselves that I'm not doing anything directly to hurt or harm people of color, so therefore I'm not racist, we're not doing the anti-racist work that needs to be done to dismantle racism in our society today. So if we're not willing to put in the work to reflect on ourselves, to look at our own racial biases, to thoughtfully reflect on the ways that we have experienced vast amounts of privilege because of the color of our skin, and how people of color have experienced the exact opposite of that, a systemic series of institutionalized disenfranchisement and oppression because of the color of their skin, there's no way we're ever going to have real productive change in this society. So with that, I have one more video in this lecture series to cover, where we're going to talk about the most difficult concept that is to cover in an intro to sociology class, which is white privilege. So again, I'm not trying to scold or reprimand us white people, myself included in this. I'm just trying to, again, use science to spread awareness to these problems, because without awareness of them and without acknowledging the existence of racism, there's no way we can move forward into this stage of engaging in the anti-racist work that is necessary to dismantle this institution.